But I want to start by talking about the inquiry that I chaired, which we launched, and this matters, the date we launched it. We launched it in April 2016, 9 months after a referendum that had shocked the establishment. It had shocked people who thought they knew what was going on. And it said to people like me, there is something awry in the way we're communicating and talking. But we launched it also at a time of extraordinary social division. We launched it saying we want to hear from the whole of civil society. I can remember making one of these many speeches in a bright room just like this, you know, from choirs and allotment societies to mainstream charities to universities and arts institutions to housing associations. We are at our best in civil society when we do stuff that we don't do because we're making a profit, or at least that's not what we started off doing it for. We might now be making a profit. We didn't start off like that. We don't do it because we have a statutory responsibility to do it. We do it because once, somewhere in our DNA, people got together and said, what's going on is not good enough. Things need to change. And universities are absolutely at the heart of my perception of what civil society is. But what did we find? We found first that universities did not respond to the very big call for evidence. Some of you individually did, but as a whole, vice-chancellors told me they thought it was fascinating, and would I give an annual lecture, and would I do this, that, and the other. But actually, the views of universities were not heard. And we, inevitably, because of my background, because of my interest, put most of our energy into hearing what was going on in communities. And we went out with the help of Goldsmiths University and many others, Citizens UK, who were mentioned earlier today, and did deep dives in 9 communities and found what you would expect. Huge divisions, divisions between the north and the south, divisions between cities and towns, divisions between young and old, divisions between those with money and those without. And none of that is surprising. But those divisions were also found within civil society. The same divisions between the long-established organisations and the new upstarts. The same divisions between those who have endowments and assets to die for and those who are scrabbling to make a living. Those divisions were bitter and deep. And I left that process of going around the listening, deep listening, thinking I am not at all surprised that a slogan tested in focus groups then delivered an election result. Because take back control was what people wanted in those communities. They felt that control was exercised over them, yes, by central government, of course. Bit of government kicking, not surprising. Yes, by local government, of course. But by the very institutions in civil society that they felt should be on their side, they felt they were treated badly and that they had lost control because of the actions of housing associations, large arts organisations, and universities. Now, there is one response to our terrible times, and I've heard it described in this conference, catastrophic, terrifying, existential threat. We can behave like the medieval monasteries and clutch the manuscripts during the Black Death and say, let's hide till it's all over. I don't think what I've heard today is that's good enough for the people engaged here. I think, frankly, a bit of that is going on in institutional life at the moment. Let's pull up the drawbridge, protect what we've got, and see if we can get through. Well, I don't think you get through a damaged democracy, a torn social fabric, if any of you saw the Dispatches programme last night, watch it and weep, and the sort of climate crisis and emergency we're facing. You don't get through those things by protecting your institution. You get it by doing some things differently. And what we heard people say to us time and time and time again in different words and different language is there are problems in this place. We are proud of the place we live in. As a young man said to me, it may be crap here, but it's my place and I'm proud of it. They were proud of the spaces that they met in and engaged in. But we made a commitment at the beginning of the inquiry we would never meet except in a civil society space. I've been to some pretty rubbish spaces. We signal to the population of this country that it's not a priority for us, them getting together and meeting and talking, because we put them in places that are damp and cold and pretty miserable. So places and spaces matter to people. Identity and belonging matter to people. The nature of work and what it means in the future matters to people. Until and somebody's going to correct me, but I think till 15 or 20 years ago, for most men in this country, their place of work was their place of identity. It is no longer the case. And there is no forecast that suggests people will say in 10, 15, 20 years' time, as they do in my home city of York, I'm a Rowntree's man or a railways man. They will not have that same identity. And just as you don't individually have the same identity with your university, people don't have that about place of work. And we heard, of course we heard, that movements and networks are challenging the institutions, which in turn are sometimes reaching out and sometimes moving their boundaries and sometimes engaging differently, but all too often are not. Now, I'm more aware than I could be that place is a fashionable concept in the higher education world. It's a sort of spray-on brand. I've noticed it recently. I keep hearing very important people telling me, place really, really matters. And yeah, it does. And every university in this country, I think with the exception of the Open University, is defined and rooted in its place. But I think that like many, many place-based institutions, you sort of weren't that serious about it for a time, and now you are again. Sinner repenteth, and that is fantastic. But what it means for the place you are in and what you do there is far more important than the spray-on brand. It's not just a thing we say, because if you do that, you are letting down the dislocated, damaged, and frankly very angry communities which surround you. And if you do that, I don't think the next generation will forgive you very lightly. So I'm interested in talking to you today about the role of anchor institutions. It's a phrase that was developed originally by Bruce Katz in the States, I think it comes from there, where they talk about the eds and the meds, the educational establishments and the medical establishments. And in this country, we have a much broader definition. But an anchor institution is an organisation which has no choice but to be in its place. There is no boardroom saying, do you know what, numbers are a bit down in Bristol, shall we go somewhere else? And yet if you walk down our high street, institutions that I grew up with as household names, a board somewhere has said that and they are no longer there. Universities are rooted in place and will be staying in a place. And as I say, you can be the monastery on the hill if you want. I wouldn't recommend it. I've had vice-chancellors saying to me, I don't really buy this anchor institution. We're a global brand. We have reach. We are an intellectual giant. Yeah, you may be. But every single decision you take will shape the place in which you are. If you outsource your cleaning contract to a company that pays cleaners below the living wage, you are hardwiring poverty into your place. Because all the research tells you that women's wages are what determines people's routes out of poverty. So don't come saying it's a really tough place to work, Julia, because it's so poor here. You've done it. If you don't maintain your common areas, if you allow your cuts to mean you don't quite maintain that bit of green space, or you let that building get a bit dilapidated, or you vacate that place that you tried in the centre of town but it really didn't work for you, you are sending a signal that you don't really mind about that place. And that is demoralising and experienced and people feeling it. If you locate lots of your students in one area of town, you are actually closing the primary schools, so get real. That's what you've chosen to do. And that's why I say anchor institutions have power in a place that is in every single thing they do. And if you are place-focused, you will test everything you do by that. Because, of course, anchor institutions have extraordinary power to transform and to change places. But in my pretty long experience now, they only do that by serving that place, not leading. There is no God-given right, because you are sitting on a rich institution, to determine what a place which is privileged to have you, how they should respond to you. You are there as servants to that place. And if your recruitment is designed to ensure that you bring in people locally, and that you pay them properly, and that you give them good jobs, when you can. Of course, your search for a professor is going to be global, but your search for a cleaner probably isn't. If you make sure that your procurement is local when it can be, you are building a local economy. That matters. It matters enormously. But other things matter too. If you treat your place as a place of research and just a site for interest through your microscope, you're not treating that place with respect. If, however, you align your purpose, your image, your sense of who you are as an institution with the history and heritage and culture of that place, you are building confidence and you're building resilience. if you invest in looking at the economy as it goes forward, not as it was once, but as it's going to be in the future, you will be equipping that place and supporting that place to deal with the extraordinary economic shocks we are about to face. If you choose not to do that because it's really not that interesting and actually it's not a priority at the moment, you are leaving that place vulnerable. And I would say you're leaving your institution pretty vulnerable too. Because to serve a community that is desperate, that is angry and divided, in which the brightest and best have got up and gone, is not actually good for the institution. It doesn't bring you the strength and the attractiveness, which I'll talk about in a moment. If you use your place in your place, to use in that lovely phrase of Lem Sissay, to name the unnamed, to speak of unspeakable things, to hold a record, to give an account of what's happening in your place, not, as I say, through your microscope, because you are deeply part of that place. You are building resilience and capacity. You're actually building what I would call community wealth, because you're building the sort of community in which you want to do business. If you're consistent in your long-term investment, and don't follow the fads and fashions we're doing place this year, but perhaps not next, if you can make your relationship with the place, whether it's your city or your region, and it will be different for different ones of you, you will reap a reward which is far, far more than the fashionable saying of we're very focused on place at the moment. Because I've heard it said about this conference that you are the sort of disruptors, you're the challengers, you're the tricky mob, you're the ones who try and get things changed. I think this agenda is not for the challengers, it's for the institutions. It's for the leaders in these institutions to understand that this stuff is mission critical. We heard in the inquiry that trust and legitimacy is fleeing from every institution you can think about. And we've heard more and more in this, dare I say it, ghastly election, the way in which the trust that was once held in the BBC has gone, the way in which trust in the NHS is being deliberately and systematically eroded. Don't have any comfort that universities are somehow immune to that sense that your legitimacy and your right to be there is not God-given. You may be rich, you may sit on a lot of money, and you may have a wonderful balance sheet, but you only really hold it in trust for future generations. And although you'll probably do quite well out of the election as universities, the long game requires the sort of trust and legitimacy which you have had, you could have, many of you still do have, but most companies in this country would give their eye teeth for. And so therefore, for the leadership of universities not to take this terribly seriously and to recognise that what happens next in how you are viewed is not a nice to have. It's not an engagement activity, although engagement matters. It's not a broadcast activity, although sometimes you'll need to broadcast. It's about deep engagement in the places in which you live, because it's from them that you derive your ability to survive and your ability to do good in the future. The enduring purpose of a university has always been to connect people who know stuff with those who don't know it, connect academics and researchers and scholars to each other. Connect, I would say, academics and activists in a way that when it works wonderfully, and I think the Joseph Rowntree Foundation embodied this, moved mountains. That power of connection is not something you do if you pull up the drawbridge and say it's all getting a bit scary out there. So what we argued for in the inquiry, and somewhere, the website was up there, you can all have it in a minute, we argued for a new set of behaviours, a new set of attitudes and practices from all of us in civil society, from all the institutions and organisations, endowed foundations and community organisations. And this new framework will mean different things to different people. But we called it a pact because we liked an acronym. We talked about power, about needing a fundamental shift of power. If people see universities, and I've said the same to housing associations and arts organisations, as accruing power and holding on to it, you will lose legitimacy by the day. If they see that power as new power, the current that makes the place work, the power that is always available when you need a platform, the power that comes from convening people who are awkward and difficult and don't always get on, but hey, universities have great places and great facilitation. The power that comes from deep connection and understanding, the power that comes from sharing your knowledge and your research. None of this appears on a ref or a TEF or a KEF, but it's actually what you do in a place. So a shift of power is not about giving power away, because new power is not about something you give to somebody. New power is how you share it and make that the current, the electricity that makes your place work. We talked about accountability. I can look at the balance sheet, I can look at a set of accounts, I'm quite bright like that, of any university in this room, and it will tell me nothing about what you have done in the place. There might be nice pictures around it. But the accountability that says, we are here for the long term, we're not going anywhere, we are wedded to Bristol or Oxford or Kingston or wherever you are, we are in this place and we are therefore making common cause, gives you a different sort of accountability. It allows you to make an explanation of what you're doing and why you're doing things in the way that you are. We talked about connections and the importance of deep human connections. And we talked about trust. Because organisations that are not trusted, at a time when trust is the biggest, most precious currency any of us have, are organisations that are at deep risk. And I've got 5 minutes, so I'll go. Trust really matters. And you will work quite hard to get your students to trust you. Well, they're paying, aren't they? So they ought to. You need to work just as hard to get your neighbours to trust you, to get the institutions, the other organisations in your area to trust you. Because none of us normally trust our richest neighbours. We think they're all right without us. You have to go the extra mile to make it clear that you are a trustworthy partner in it for the long term. Now, I've talked about this incredibly uncertain future. I've talked about our dented and damaged democracy. I've talked about our torn social fabric. I've talked, and doesn't everybody at the moment, about the climate emergency. But I also feel tremendously optimistic, because in that time of existential threat is a time for change. It's a time for doing things differently. And walking around some of the sessions you're having today and listening to people talk, it seemed to me that there is a whole new opportunity for the modern 21st century universities we go into the next decade, as institutions with real sense of place, a real pride in place and ability to share that place, with a willingness and a confidence to have boundaries that are porous and are not policed. It feels very old-fashioned to say, my boundary is here and you will not cross it. What I observe is the really interesting work that's going on at the edges of institutions, between organisations, and as I always say, look for the interesting stuff at the margins. Look at the universities who've been serious about their place, the way they are shaped by their place, the way in which they commit to their place, and see the trust grow and the sense of sharing an opportunity ever expand. Universities, or people from universities, are used to being the cleverest person in the room. When you work in place, you are never the cleverest person in the room, because by definition you know less. But to go in with humility, offering the assets you have, the extraordinary analytic power, the buildings you have, the capacity you have, seems to me to be an offer that has never been more needed, but never been more urgent. We argued that a re-energised, renewed civil society had huge opportunity, and that if we walk away from this opportunity, if we say it's difficult and we'd like to protect what we have, thank you very much, we won't be protecting what we have. We'll be setting ourselves or our successors up for failure. But if we don't do that, if we relax our boundaries, if we work across, and if we invest in the communities which we are there to serve, we will continue to attract the students we need. We will attract the very best staff, and we will be operating in places that have confidence and ability to take the next steps. The alternative is to do what one of the community groups said about another big institution, and this was not a university. They spend all their time looking at their funders and regulators. They don't even know that we're here. I don't think that's the right place for a 21st century university to end up. Thank you very much.